We're now going live. Of course, the minute I go live is the minute my dog wakes up and wants to get some attention. So this week we're talking about um, Jackie Woodson's Feathers and Monster Calls um, by Patrick Ness. And then if we have time, we'll make some other connections to other stuff as well. And so I really want this to be a chance for y'all to talk and make connections and think about stuff. So I'll let you open up with what it is you most would want to talk about with one of these two books.
I really liked the book Feathers. I thought it was, I know it was written back in the 70s, and I think that the way that they kind of explored how a person feels like, even though I might look different on the outside, I'm just the same as you. You know, I get treated differently just because I live on a certain side of a highway. And so, while he felt like Jesus felt like, maybe my life would be better if my family felt we would be treated better if we moved on the other side. The other kids that already lived on that side were like, I wonder what's going on over there. Everything is so much better. I really enjoyed that book.
I
Cool.
know.
Yeah, awesome. And we had, is it Shaim?
Shaheen.
Shaheem joined us right after we got started, so welcome, Shaheem. I didn't want you to feel left out. Yeah,
Oh
no,
yeah, I was having some difficulty.
it's okay. Now, Feathers takes place in '71, but it was written actually about 5 years ago. So it was written recently. It just takes place in the past. And one of the reasons it and Esperanza Rising I like to use is that how we represent the past to children to me is a really interesting dilemma. So, right, as you point out, we're on the heels of desegregation. This is clearly an urban setting. There's a major highway that's dividing the city. Of course, that seems like something old, but that's really not. That's a lot. That's how you could describe a lot of modern day cities and a lot of modern day schools. Frankly, there's been a lot of work to resegregate schools, particularly along class lines in North Carolina and elsewhere. So they work really hard to make sure certain income brackets, like they'll carve out the country club area and make sure it goes to a certain school, and then right next to it there might be Section 8 housing or a mobile home park where people are poor, and they end up all in this bus to some other place. So it is kind of an interesting novel in that it talks about the past, but brings up some problems that really still plague us about who gets to go to what schools and what that looks like, and then how do children of different races and groups feel welcomed if they don't look like the majority of the people at a school in particular. So, sorry, I didn't want to hog the conversation. Others might want to talk about something else with Feathers.
Um, Not particularly Feathers, but I wanted to jump on Monster Calls. I think that was an awesome book to me because I mean, not I guess it was a dark as far as what we were talking about earlier. I guess it was kind of a dark children's book, but I feel like you would learn something from it. Connor was a kid. He was still a kid, back when he was young. I just felt like I feel like he dealt with a lot of stuff normally what children wouldn't go through. Not every day, young kids or young children lose their mom. So I feel like that was a huge thing. And the monster just giving him those three stories kind of just made some relation to other people's lives that I know. So I just thought Monster Call was a good book. It was a great book.
Yeah, that was my favorite as well.
Why?
Um, I mean, I like books that have a deeper meaning to it, but I didn't think it was a children's book. Like, I wouldn't recommend it to a child.
Right.
But
I
like,
I liked the book. I liked the book, but I kind of felt more of a something with Feathers, because to be honest with you, I just like Shaim said, I didn't think it was. I wouldn't want my young kids reading it, or
no
my
way,
kids are
no way.
older. They're in high school. They probably can read it, but my best friend's kids, they're like in elementary school. I'm like, especially if you never dealt with
Grief.
someone dying from cancer. Me personally, I've never lost anybody really close to me, so I don't know how I would act. I might, to me, he did better than I probably would have, in the book. He coped, he dealt with a lot of stuff, so Feathers to me just appealed more to me. So
And see, that's another thing. As far as how you deal with grief, that's a whole nother topic right there within itself nowadays. How do we actually deal with grief? Like sometimes it's consequential, sometimes it's positive. I mean, who knows? I mean, is it some? Everyone deals with grief differently. That's what me and Emily was talking about on the discussion.
Well, it's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it until you just said it, but Feathers also is pretty deep grief.
Yeah.
In as much as Franny is really anxious about her mother. Like, we know that her mother has miscarried before, and that her mother brought a child to term that died as a baby. They have a picture of it, and that's pretty heavy too. I mean, right? So it's interesting that they're very differently heavy. Whereas the monster that is cancer kind of looms over this whole text. Feathers, it's a really much a background thing. But it's one of the questions I always wonder about with books like this, or even Esperanza Rising. The reality is, like, children go through these things, right? I was just posting, I think, on Shaheem's comment on Monster a minute ago about we see refugees in the news, right? And there are young children, younger than these kids in the novels, and young, elementary age children, or immigrants, right, who move here because their parents come to this country, and they don't really have a choice. They have to come. They're children. And so they're very young and they go through it, but it's not the normal, what we think of as the normal experience. And so I always wonder, like, in particular, are these really, because I didn't experience these things as a child either, would these be good books if I, at 13 or 12 or 11, like Franny and Connor, if I were going through this, would I recognize the rage that Connor has? Because he is angry, and he has every right to be angry. I mean, his dad left and went to America. His grandmother is not a grandmother who cooks for him and is sweet. And now cancer's come. Like, the one thing he had was his mom, and now cancer's come, and it's going to take her. I'd be pretty full of rage, too.
The book A Monster Calls, it kind of reminded me of, I don't know if y'all seen the movie The Perks of Being a Wallflower. That's what it kind of reminded me of. And I kind of could relate to Connor because, like, when I was, like, 12, I lost my great-grandmother to breast cancer. So that's why I thought it was a good book.
And if you don't mind me asking, my condolences to your loss. But how did you deal with grief? Like, how did you take it in? You don't mind me asking.
At her funeral, I was just like, I was in tears. Like, I couldn't even go view her body. So it was pretty bad.
But like kind of a different opinion than what most of you guys have said about, like, those books being kind of dark for young kids. But in a way, sometimes it's also good for kids to be exposed to the reality of life that we live in. So for as teachers, to kind of hide reality from them, and then let's say X amount of years go by, and let's say they could be 18 years old, and this is the first time they ever heard of anything happening, or being 15 and barely hearing about racism. So in a way, I feel it's all right to expose to expose kids to certain situations. But
yeah, I agree as well.
No problem. And then, like, also switching subjects, like I saw a couple of connections from A Monster Calls to Feathers. Like, for example, you had Franny, who she didn't have a father figure, and Trevor, he wasn't the main character, but the same way he was a bully. But at the same time, it was said he never had a father figure either. And the same thing with Connor. So I feel all those characters just had a lot of inner anger, and they just found different forms of accepting the pain that they were in and how to go about getting over it. Like, whenever I was reading the Monster Calls, like the picture that was in my head the whole time, I tried to put it on discussion post, but I couldn't get the picture to post. But have you ever seen that one picture where it has, like, somebody holding on to a rope, where it says holding on doesn't always mean it's, like, less pain?
Yeah, I think I
So,
know.
you know, the longer you hold on, the worse your hand gets instead of letting go. And,
I
you
think I've
know,
seen it.
You bring up an interesting point. I was while I was mowing the grass, I have the audio version of Monster Calls, and I was re-listening to it because I'm a nerd rather than music. I listen to Monster Calls, um, and it was that I was got to that first scene where Connor's in the schoolyard and the bully boys are picking on him, and then he says no, they weren't doing anything, right? And then and I was thinking that was when I was like, oh, that's right. There are definitely these bully figures there. I mean, they're bully figures in Esperanza. They're definitely bully figures like Trevor, and you know, Jesus Boy really kind of nails Trevor. And embarrasses him, right? So he doesn't actually engage him in a fight so much. I mean, it doesn't. I think Trevor takes a punch at him and misses, and he falls down because he's already broken his arm or whatever. But it did kind of make me wonder about. It's a different kind of grief. Thinking about what Eric was talking about with grief, is that absent father or the kind of grief that leads some of these kids to be bullies. So I thought it was kind of interesting how, particularly in Feathers, Franny develops understanding, right?
Mhm.
She does a little understanding about why Trevor behaves the way he does, and that helps her to think differently.
Right, because what was funny is at the beginning of the book when Jesus Boy first arrives, she when she talks, she's like, well, everybody pretty much expects it from him. Like he's going to be the one to show out, and you can't mention his father because one time he flipped out when somebody mentioned, oh, your father's white, and he's not there, and so until Jesus Boy gets there, it's pretty much everybody just like, we're not going to mention this. He's known to flip out, and then when Jesus Boy kind of confronts him about it, because somehow he figures out, hey, you calling me white, but you got some white in you too, and you trying to make me feel bad for being different, but you're just as different as I am,
Right.
and so and even though he balls up his fist, and they both see him about to engage, he goes to pick him up, and she recognizes that too. She goes to pick him up, help him get up off the ground too. So I don't know. I just, like I said, I just kind of was drawn more to that book, to Feathers, only because I've lived in inner city school in DC. My father was in the military, so I lived in. Even though we lived on base, we went to public school, and we went to public school. You either went to public school, or you went to Catholic school. And we didn't go to Catholic school. So when I was young, probably in kindergarten, I remember there being some white kids at our school, and then by the time I got to the first or second grade, they got beat up so much that their parents had to take them out of school just because they were white.
Wow.
And so when we ended up, my father got orders to South Carolina. It was a totally different scenario because then I was the minority there. When in D.C., the part we lived in was majority black people at our school. So I just kind of felt a drawing to that story because I could relate to it. I can relate to that situation of seeing a white child being treated bad because they're white, just because they're white. So I really like that story.
And we don't find out for so long, right? It's part of the nice drama of that particular novel is that we don't know what Jesus Boy's story is for so long. For so long. And that's kind of as a nice tension for the reader. Like, well, why is he there? Like, what's causing that? Like, I don't understand. And one of the things I do like about the book is that it disrupts our. I think it disrupts our sense that once there was segregation and then there was no segregation, and I don't think it wasn't that easy, right? Like we know when we study history, we get to the history of the 60s and 70s, we know it wasn't that simple. But sometimes books for children, in particular, sort of represent it as there used to be, and then it was all over and everything was fine. And that's not the case. It's not the case now, as you pointed out. Shay, that sometimes, like even in our more recent history, we find ways of using race or something else to discriminate in any number of ways, right? So there's always Franny has that moment where she keeps telling to herself, right? You remember that time you had chicken pox and you were late and everyone treated you badly because you were the outsider. Imagine you weren't an outsider because of your race; you're an outsider for just being an outsider. Like you were late to school, and then imagine how bad that is for someone like because there's not gonna. I mean, chickenpox end, right? But being white or being black or being any
That
race is not. That's gonna stay, right? So you really have to
her
face.
brother. When they even how the girls treat her brother because they find out that he's deaf. Like he's very attractive and he plays basketball really well. And then when they try to talk to him and they see him moving his hands, you know, they're like, oh, he's deaf. So they automatically assume he's deaf and dumb. And so Franny, it ticks her off because she's like, well, why don't you, you know, just leave those girls alone and just stick with the people who are deaf, who understand what you're going through. And he's like, no, I want to I want to be a part just like everybody else, you know. And that was the symbolism with crossing the highway for him. He was like, I want to go into the world that that you're in, because you can come into my world and you know, speak my sign language with me, but you can also relate, you know, talk to other people who aren't deaf, and you don't have to worry about that. So I like that.
Margaret, you haven't had a chance to speak much yet. I know people here are very eager to talk. This has been the most eager group
I know, I don't want to interrupt.
I know you don't interrupt because it's all good stuff. I was just curious.
Great book.
Whatchamacallit, I think everybody's brought up some really good points, like y'all said. I think my favorite was probably Esperanza Rising, just because I remember reading it back when I was younger. But all of these books, I think, kind of brought us out of our comfort zone, as you were saying, because I had like some dealings with grief and things when I was younger, but I didn't have much dealings with race because I was from a very predominantly white town and things like that. And it was kind of good to read about them when I was younger, because then when I come to other towns, it's not like, oh my God, there's black people, and like it's not a shock to my system, and it's not a shock to my system when people treat other people differently because of their skin color. And that's what I really liked about all of these books, because I didn't really learn anything about, especially in, I can't think of the name of it now, where she was a foster child, and I had never really,
Hollis Woods.
yeah, Hollis Woods.
Something.
I really liked that one because I really had just no experience with the foster system, and so it was really interesting to read about that one. Yeah.
I hope at 7:20. I hope that the books have been. I said you read Esperanza before, Margaret, and I don't know if any of you have read any of the others before, but I hope they've been kind of interesting as much as like they're the early readers, right? There's picture books and the kind of like Frog and Toad, where like 3 words on a page, and they're meant to help young people read, and they're useful. I find them kind of boring just to read myself. And then we have, you know, the kind of books that you're expected to read as a high school student, you know, like Steinbeck and Toni Morrison and, you know, Shakespeare and all that kind of stuff. And then these YA novels that are really for like 4th grade to 8th grade, often just kind of disappear. And for some reason, one is that a lot of young people at that point decide they're sick of reading and they don't want to read anymore. So for some people I have as students, they quit reading anything that wasn't assigned for school after a certain point. And so many of these books I think are really interesting, but they're not necessarily books. When I taught elementary or middle school, I would have assigned for the whole class, but I would definitely have given out to students, particularly if they were going through something, and saying, well, there's this really interesting book over on the shelf called Feathers. You might want to have a look at it. Think about what children go through. And so part of the idea of that reading ladder around a theme was about, developing like, well, what are some books that share themes but, maybe different? So whereas something like Feathers is realistic fiction, and Monster Calls is obviously a blend of fantasy and realistic fiction, what are other kinds of books that might work around topics like grief or disability, right? So how we engage people who are deaf or blind or physically disabled in some way, and how to, and what kind of books show up in our curriculum for that kind of stuff. So I tried really hard to pick books that we're going to sort of show things that maybe we don't think about a lot with young people. Because, of course, young people are just people, and they have families, and they go through grief, and they go through loss, and they experience prejudice and racism in school. They are treated badly because of the way they look or because of disability they have. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, is that children aren't sort of born and kept under glass for a long time and then suddenly are grown up. That, it's a lot more complicated than that. So I hope some of the books we've read have been useful to that end. Was there anything else about Monster Calls or Feathers that you wanted to make sure you asked about or mentioned or commented on?
I think that just when talking about Feathers, I saw a lot of like comparisons to Esperanza Rising, just because that's the one I had the most experience with. When Esperanza was growing up, and the river that separated her, like the rich people and the poor people, I kind of saw that with the bridge and white people and black people, and I kind of thought that was like an interesting connection, and really could teach kids about things like that when they don't really understand. Neither of the characters, when that was going on, really understood why they couldn't all just live together, and so it was kind of cool that that went over that.
Yeah, the characters in Feathers, they mention that highway, but they don't question that it's there necessarily, which is kind of an interesting dilemma in that book. You don't get a lot of adult interactions, a little bit with mom and dad for Franny, but there's not a lot of adult interactions, so there's not a grown-up figure who makes sense of things in Feathers. And so I think one thing so interesting is that she's constantly trying to puzzle this out, and part of that puzzle for her got started with this poem from Emily Dickinson that her teacher gave her that she's trying to think through. But you see her trying to think these things through on her own, and she never quite understands why this highway exists, right? Why there's over there and over here. She just knows it does, and it has a really powerful place. So that, I think, would probably lead to some really interesting conversations if I were going to use this in a classroom. Like, these would become, like, what are the places and towns that we know where, that for whatever reason. Growing up in South Georgia, the common phrase "from the other side of the tracks" was used all the time, and that was a very real thing, because the railroad really did cut towns. I don't know if that's the same way for Greenville. Greenville's a little bit differently set up, but there is also an other side of the tracks in Greenville, but not any one group is limited by just that space. But other comments or thoughts about the book?
They also bring up religion in Feathers too. She, and I thought it was kind of interesting. Like at the very end, you see her starting to write letters to her sister that her mom lost like a month after she was born. Before, they didn't talk about it. The same way they didn't talk to the bully about his father. They didn't bring up the fact that their mother lost a child. Not necessarily, had a miscarriage, but the child was born, and they never brought it up. So then when she starts to, her friend asks her to go to church, and she starts thinking about faith, and she starts thinking about hope. And then at the very end of the novel, she writes these letters to her sister, who she always felt was, her mother would say, well, she's still here with us. And and at the very end, it's kind of like she, like you said, she deals with it on her own. She works through all of her questions and all her uncertainties about a lot of things. And at the end of the novel, it's kind of like she's like, okay, I had a sister. I'm not going to be the baby anymore because her mom is pregnant, and she's dealing with that too. I'm not going to be the baby anymore. And here goes another. While she's trying to get pregnant, and she's always having these, miscarriages, and so she kind of works through it herself. The same way Hollis had to work through the fact of recognizing that, hey, I'm not the, people can appreciate me for who I am. And she kind of had to deal with that too, when she was with the Reagans, and she was like, well, am I the reason why why the son and the father don't really get along? But she had to work through it herself. She had to work through her issues too, and go back to the Reagans, even though they kept telling her, we want you to be a part of our family.
It's hard. It's very hard for Hollis to hear that. That's one of the real. I don't know if it's quite grief, but it's one of the real ramifications of adopted children often is that, and it happens with children from divorced families as well, wherever there's been that separation of thinking that they're either the cause of it, or the reason it happened, or they're anxious about why things go on. It's very hard sometimes for particularly foster children like Hollis to believe that someone wants them. They see themselves as a problem because they've come in from outside, they impose, they weren't, so That's definitely an interesting point. I thought one of the interesting comments you just made there, Shay, especially was, and I hadn't seen it, but Eric opened this chat with the question of grief and how we deal with grief, or do we deal with grief? Do we just push it down and don't talk about it? But I think another thing that the Monster Calls is also about is the same question as Feathers, which is hope. Like,
Yeah.
what is the option for Connor at the end? What is the option for Jesus Boy and Franny at the end? In a world that's still racially segregated, and there are all these racial tensions in 1971. What's the hope going to look like there? And in a much more intimate sense, what's hope going to look like for Connor when his mom's gone? Like, how does he have hope at the end of that, or faith? I mean, either one. I mean, they're kind of become interchangeable concepts in Feathers a bit. But how do you have hope on the other side of grief? And do we get a sense at the end of Monster Calls that Connor is hopeful?
I think so.
Yes and no. I mean, I feel like in the story, what was the last story, the monster tells him about an invisible man, and how I guess the reason I say yes and no because at the end of the story, I feel like he coped with his mom. They actually sat down and he actually spent the last couple of minutes with his mother. And then I say no because when the monster told him that last story, he kind of like lashed out, tore his grandmother's place up, and so I feel like he can go both ways.
Shaheem, you were going to say something as well?
Yeah, but it's not really, in my opinion, it really wasn't a right way for him to deal with it. He knew that his mother was terminally ill, and so maybe in his mind, creating this monster was a way for him to deal with it.
He was in
Yes.
denial.
Yeah, it was some denial, and so I think in all these stories, there's like a common theme of these young people dealing with these terrible things in their life and finding ways to cope with it. However, they had to do it, and some of them, they like Esperanza Rising. She went on and she was like, I'm going to prove to myself that I am more than what these people think I am.
Right.
Not necessarily to prove it to them, just to prove it to herself. The same thing with Hollis. I mean, she was determined to be a problem child because that's the way some of her, some people looked at her, but really she had a good heart, and she couldn't let the people that she cared about just kind of, she couldn't let I forgot the woman's name who was taking care of her, who was looking out for her. But she knew she was forgetting things. She was like, I can't let her be by herself. I have to take care of her. And she thought about her sister. She could have called her sister at any time to come and get her. Her sister said, call me. But she was like, nope, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let her go ahead and do what she wanted to do, and she'll stay with me until it's time for her to come back. So, I mean, all these young people are dealing with these impossible, very terrible situations.
That's what I was going to say.
But, going back to the...
oh, my bad.
Okay, you go.
Oh, I was going to say, I like the choice of books because, like, it's not typical children's book, like fiction and fantasy. Like, they cause us to, like, form a perspective and look at things differently than how we normally would.
Well, in a way that I feel that, like, Copper, that he felt like he had hope was just the fact that, I mean, he was in denial throughout most of the story, but turned everything up at his grandma. So I think that helped him relieve inner tension that he had built up to where he was never able to express his feelings, what he was going through. And then, whenever he finally told the monster his nightmare where they saw it together, I think that was really the turning point as far as his feelings goes, where he knew and accepted what was going to happen. And that, that's when right after, he want to go watch, he want to go see his mom, right before she passed away. Yeah. So that leaves me with a sense that, he has gone through enough to have hope of, for him to keep going.
That moment where he destroys his grandmother's sitting room is a hard one. I'm noticing we're at the end of time, so I don't want to hold you much longer, but one of the ways I see that is that so much of what's going on with the monster, like the first half of the novel almost, Connor's really not sure the monster's there. There are these leaves on his floor. There are these little things that make him... He doesn't know, is the monster real or not? And I think for the first time, when he destroys that room, he sees what his anger looks like, right? Anger is very internal. It's inside. His grief is inside. And when he sees the destruction of that room, he sees for the first time how dark and how bad it's gotten. But I was thinking about those last two lines of the novel when he's standing, or last few lines when he's with his mom and the monster says, or he's in there, he says, he's holding her. He knew it would come in soon, maybe even this 12:07, the moment she would slip from his grasp, no matter how tightly he held. Connor held tightly onto his mother, and by doing so, he could finally let her go. And you get the sense that things are going to be okay for him because he was finally able to love his mother and to accept, like, to hold her back and say, you'll always be a part of my life, right? You're my mother. Even when you're not here, you'll still be here. But there's a real moment, I think, of maturation for Connor at the end of that, but a very, very hard one. It's not belabored. Although I'm intrigued because behind Shaim on his wall is a quote. I don't know if the rest of y'all read this while he was talking about no matter how hard things get, they're never impossible or something like that. Is that what it says, Shaim?
Yeah, it said things get hard, but never impossible.
Yeah, so I was like, well, there you go. That was pretty much what I think a lot of these novels this summer have been about. These things get very hard in the lives, even of young people, and sort of thinking about how we develop resilience. And then the monster came to tell stories, but how these stories that we've been reading all summer are meant for young people as stories to help them be resilient and to know that people can survive things that are really tough and that they can move on. So it's 7:35. I've already run 5 minutes over. Y'all were wonderful. It was a really chatty group tonight, and I appreciate all your thoughts and comments on the novels. And I hope the connections that we're able to talk about tonight were really useful, because I know we get to talk about just the one novel at a time in the discussions, and I like these chats because we get to chat a little bit across novels and make connections. So anyway, it was lovely meeting all of you and seeing you face to face. I hope y'all have a good week, and I look forward to seeing your reading ladder drafts over the next couple of days. And then we only have 2 novels left, and then the summer's over. So it's like, boom, we're done. So good luck back at work tonight, Eric. I'm sorry you have to go back and work. The rest of us are going to go play and have fun, right?
No, right. Today, back from Walmart.
Well, good luck. Y'all have a good evening, and I'll see y'all online.
All right.
Yeah.